The wind rolled across the cemetery like it owned the land, tugging at fences, whispering through dry grass, and carrying the scent of dust and sorrow. And when the stranger stepped through the iron gate with a bundle of fresh flowers in her hands, every old memory in town seemed to pause and listen. She moved slow and careful, as if the ground itself deserved respect. Her boots soft against the dirt path, her eyes lowered, but steady, and she walked straight toward the newest grave, near the cedar tree, where the shadow lingered longest in the afternoon light. And that grave belonged to the wife of Caleb Boone, the hardest cowboy in the county. Caleb Boone had not smiled since the funeral, and folks said the laughter left his ranch the same day the coffin lowered into the earth. He kept to himself on the wide stretch of land outside town, riding fence lines at dawn, fixing broken posts in silence, and staring across the horizon as if waiting for something that would never return. He was known for his strength, for his steady aim, and for the way even grown men stepped aside when he entered a saloon. But grief had a way of humbling even the tallest oak, and it had bent Caleb in ways no storm ever could. The woman placed the flowers gently on the grave, red blooms bright against the grey stone, and she knelt without hesitation. Brushing dust from the marker that bore the name of Lillian Boone, she whispered something soft, something no one else could hear. And in that moment Caleb, who had been standing near the gate, watching from a distance, felt a sharp pull in his chest. He did not recognize her, and that bothered him, because he knew every face within 20 miles. Yet she looked as though she carried a story heavy enough to rival his own. Caleb stepped closer, boots firm, hat low, eyes narrowed not in anger but in guarded curiosity. The town had its share of gossip, and strangers rarely visited the cemetery alone, especially not with flowers for someone they had never met. When he reached her side, the wind quieted for a breath, and she looked up at him without fear, her gaze steady, almost apologetic, and she said she was sorry for his loss, her voice calm, like water over stone. And that simple kindness unsettled him more than any accusation could. She introduced herself as Clara Hayes, passing through town on her way north, and she explained that she had known Lillian briefly years ago, back when both of them worked at a small boarding house in another county. They had shared meals, shared dreams, and shared stories about wanting better lives. Clara said Lillian once spoke about a ranch under open skies, about a man who worked hard and loved quietly, and hearing that had brought Clara here to pay respects, because friendship did not fade just because miles grew wide. Caleb listened, arms crossed, jaw tight, trying to decide whether to believe her. He had never heard Lillian speak of such a friend, but that did not mean it was impossible. Lillian had been gentle, always seeing goodness where others saw dust, and perhaps she had kept parts of her past private. He felt a flicker of guilt for assuming the worst, yet grief had trained him to expect disappointment, and trust had become a luxury he no longer felt entitled to afford. Clara stood and faced him directly, the flowers still resting at the grave, and she told him she did not come to intrude or to stir memories he wished to bury. She simply wanted to honor a promise she made long ago, that if she ever passed through this region, she would visit her friend. Her words carried sincerity, and there was no hint of manipulation in her expression, only quiet respect. And Caleb noticed how the sunlight caught in her hair, turning it into a warm glow against the pale stone as the afternoon stretched. The two of them remained by the grave, speaking in low tones about Lillian, about the way she used to laugh at small jokes, about her fondness for wildflowers along the fence line. And for the first time since the funeral, Caleb allowed himself to remember something without feeling like he was drowning. Clara did not try to replace his loss. She did not offer empty comfort. Instead, she simply listened when he spoke, and when silence settled between them, it felt less like emptiness and more like understanding. Caleb did not sleep that night. The ranch felt louder than usual, cattle shifting in the pens, wind tapping against the barn walls, and memories circling like restless hawks. He kept seeing Clara standing by the grave, not as a stranger, but as a quiet presence that did not demand anything from him, and that unsettled him more than arguments ever could, because grief had made him believe the world would always be sharp and unkind. Yet her visit felt different, like a soft knock on a locked door he had refused to open. The next morning he rode out before sunrise, the sky painted in pale gold, and the land stretching wide beneath him. He tried to focus on fence repairs and water troughs, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the cemetery, to the flowers resting on Lillian's stone, and to the way Clara had spoken her name with care. He told himself it meant nothing, that people passed through towns every day. But deep inside he knew something had shifted, because for the first time since the funeral, the silence did not feel entirely empty. Around noon, he returned to town for supplies, and as fate would have it, Clara was outside the general store speaking with the clerk. She wore the same simple dress, dust on her boots, hat resting in her hands, and when she saw him, she did not flinch or rush away. Instead, she offered a small nod, respectful and calm. Caleb felt the familiar tension rise in his shoulders, yet he noticed how townsfolk watched them, curious but cautious, as if sensing a story unfolding between two quiet souls. Clara approached him first, asking if the flowers had been acceptable, and he answered with a steady voice that yes, they were fine, more than fine. He surprised himself with that admission. She smiled gently, not in triumph, but in understanding, and told him she would be leaving town in a few days, continuing her journey north. Her words carried no invitation, no expectation, only honesty, and somehow that honesty felt heavier than any promise. That evening the sky darkened suddenly, clouds rolling in fast, wind snapping across the plains, and before long a storm broke loose over the ranch. Caleb was out checking the western fence when lightning struck close enough to rattle the ground. Rain poured hard, turning dirt into mud, and in the distance he spotted a figure struggling near the edge of his property. It was Clara, trying to secure her small wagon against the rising wind, and without thinking he rode toward her. He reached her just as the wagon tipped slightly, helping steady it with firm hands, the rain soaking through his shirt, and she thanked him through the storm. Breath uneven but determined, they worked together to tie the canvas tight and guide the horses to safer ground. And in that wild moment under thunder and flashing light, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust, forming in the middle of chaos, like a seed taking root in cracked soil. When they finally found shelter in the barn, both drenched and breathing hard, Clara admitted that she had debated whether to visit the ranch at all. She feared being unwelcome, feared reopening pain, but she felt that Lillian deserved remembrance beyond a simple stone. And Caleb listened carefully, realizing that her courage was not meant to replace his loss, but to honor it, and he saw now that her presence was not an intrusion, but a continuation of friendship that time had not erased. As the storm softened into steady rain, Caleb fetched dry blankets from the loft and offered one to her, their hands brushing briefly, a simple touch that carried warmth instead of tension. He found himself speaking more openly than he had with anyone in months, admitting how the silence of the house felt unbearable, how every corner reminded him of laughter that would not return. And Clara did not interrupt, she only listened, her quiet attention steady as the land after rain. And when she finally spoke, she said, "Grief does not mean love has ended. It only means love is waiting to be remembered." The morning after the storm felt different on the ranch. The air cleaner, the land washed fresh, and Caleb noticed how the sunlight touched the fields without the heavy weight he used to feel. Clara was preparing to leave town that day, her wagon packed and horses ready, and yet she had stopped by the ranch one last time to say goodbye, not as someone running away, but as someone honoring a promise. Caleb met her near the fence line, where wildflowers grew in patches just like Lillian used to love. He surprised himself by asking her to walk with him to the cemetery again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. Clara agreed without hesitation, and together they rode slowly through town, past curious glances and quiet whispers. When they reached the grave, Caleb removed his hat, something he had not done there before, and he noticed how peaceful the place felt, no longer only a reminder of loss, but a space where memories could rest gently instead of hurting sharply. Clara placed a small note beneath the flowers she had brought earlier, explaining that friendship does not end with distance, and that Lillian had once spoken kindly about a ranch under wide skies. Caleb read the note in silence, his throat tightening. But this time the feeling was not only sorrow, it was gratitude, because he realized his wife's life had touched others in ways he never knew, and that meant her memory lived beyond his loneliness. As they stood there together, the wind moved softly through the cedar tree, and Caleb finally spoke about the guilt he carried, how he had buried himself in work, how he feared moving forward would mean forgetting Lillian. Clara turned to him and said that healing does not replace love, it grows from it. Her words settled deep inside him, like water reaching dry roots, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that living again would not betray the past days past. And though Clara was still planning to continue her journey, she found herself delaying departure, helping at the ranch with small tasks, sharing meals at the long wooden table, and talking about simple things like weather, cattle, and distant towns. Caleb noticed how laughter slowly returned to his home, not loud or forced, but natural and steady, and he began to look forward to mornings instead of dreading them one evening. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm colors, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch steps watching the horizon. He admitted that her visit had changed something in him, that the ranch no longer felt like a place frozen in time. Clara replied that she had not come to heal him, only to honor her friend. But sometimes honoring the past creates space for the future, and the quiet between them felt comfortable, not heavy. Caleb realized that grief had kept his heart locked, and Clara had not forced it open. She had simply stood nearby with kindness, allowing him to decide when to turn the key. He looked toward the fields stretching endlessly before them, and for the first time imagined sharing that view with someone who understood both loss and hope, not as a replacement, but as a companion on the road ahead. When Clara finally prepared to leave, Caleb walked her to the gate instead of watching from a distance like before. He thanked her sincerely for the flowers, for the visit, and for reminding him that love can exist in memory without turning into pain. She mounted her wagon with a gentle smile, promising to write when she could. And as she drove away under the wide western sky, Caleb felt the ranch breathe easier, his soul lighter than it had been in a long time. And though the wind still moved across the land, it no longer carried only dust. It carried the quiet beginning of healing, and maybe even the promise of tomorrow.